The Martin NB-2, also known as the NBS-1, was a twin-engine night bomber operated by the United States Army Air Service, and then its successor, the Army Air Corps, at the start of the interwar period. Not only did it have the distinction of being the first US bomber aircraft to be mass-produced, but it was also highly successful, and found itself earning fame in a few notable events. Though little known today, this aircraft would form the nucleus of what would become one of the world's most potent bombing forces. It would give a fledgling aviation industry vital experience in the production of more complex equipment, and it would aid in the development and testing of new and emerging technologies. The NB-2 was a direct development of the Martin NB-1, which was the first bomber to be designed and built by the United States. The NB-1, which we've already covered on this channel in another video, was a promising design, but its career had been cut short by the end of the First World War. This was then further complicated by the fact that the US Army Air Service, which had been growing steadily, albeit at a slower pace compared to its European counterparts, was subjected to severe cutbacks in 1919 and 1920. In total, its combat strength had been reduced to just 4 pursuit squadrons and 4 bombing squadrons. This was partly because the US Congress had returned to its pre-war funding strategy, which entailed spoon-feeding its military just enough funding to make it somewhat relevant, and partly because there was a big debate raging about the role and future of aircraft as a military weapon. Now, these cutbacks had put Glenn Martin in a bit of an awkward situation. He'd borrowed and then invested a significant amount of capital to build his new factory in Cleveland, Ohio, on the assumption that the war would bring in a significant number of production orders. But the austerity of the immediate post-war years was so bad that his company could not even satisfy its initial financial backers. Martin then had to take out new loans to buy them out. Then the chief designer of the NB-1, Donald Douglas, left to form his own aircraft company, and with no fresh orders coming in, he had to begin cutting his staff. Things were admittedly looking bleak at the start of 1920, but then the floundering Glenn L. Martin Company was offered a lifeline. It was provided by one Brigadier General William L. Mitchell, more affectionately known in the aviation world as Billy Mitchell. A strong advocate for the development of air power, and one who had something of a penchant for butting heads with the more traditional army leaders, Mitchell voiced his approval of the Martin NB-1 with enough volubility that the army agreed to purchase an improved version of the design in the summer of 1920. Martin received a contract to produce 20 new bomber aircraft under the designation of MB-2. The company was given a tight deadline to both modify the design and then build the 20 machines, as Billy Mitchell wanted to use them in an upcoming naval exercise the following year. In 1921, various tests were to be conducted against captured German naval assets, and Mitchell wanted to prove that the bomber could be used as an effective weapon against capital ships. Now, along with being the driving force for ordering the NB-2, Billy Mitchell also recommended most of the design changes that could be found within the aircraft itself. Several things set the NB-1 and NB-2 apart, and a lot of this was driven by the requirement to carry a heavier payload. The NB-2 was slightly larger, with a wingspan of 74 feet 2 inches compared to 71 feet 5 inches on the NB-1. The wings also incorporated a new folding mechanism, which allowed for easier transportation and storage. It had a simplified landing gear, with 2 large 44-inch main wheels replacing the 4 smaller wheels of the NB-1. These were also later equipped with new pneumatic shock absorbers. The large gap between the wheels then facilitated the addition of an internal bomb bay, which helped to reduce drag, as on the NB-1 the payload was carried externally. In total, the NB-2 could carry up to 1,800 pounds of bombs internally, and these could be a mix of small anti-personnel bombs or larger high-explosive bombs, including the new 1,000-pounder. This was almost double the payload of the NB-1, and it was the main improvement that Billy Mitchell had pushed for. One key part of the design did remain the same though. The NB-2 would be defended by 5 .30-caliber machine guns. A pair were mounted in the nose, another pair was installed in the upper fuselage, and one was in a ventral position to protect the aircraft's vulnerable underside. The crew complement had been increased from 3 to 4, but sources do conflict as to whether this was done to add a second dedicated gunner, or to provide a second qualified pilot. My bet, personally, is on the latter, however I won't declare it with complete certainty, as we just don't really know. Other changes in the design also included the removal of the fuel tanks from the fuselage to streamlined cells in the lower wings. This was done mainly to reduce the risks posed by a fire, as the fuselage structure was built primarily from wood, but also to reduce the amount of toxic fumes the 4-man crew would be subjected to during flight, which was a kindness. And another noticeable design change was the mounting of the engines. Back on the NB-1, they were installed in the gap between the wings, but on the NB-2 they were mounted on the lower wing itself, and partly connected to the structure of the undercarriage. Now this not only reduced the stress on the upper wing during flight, but also allowed for simpler fuel lines to be installed, as the engine was more or less directly adjacent to the fuel tanks, and more importantly than that, it allowed for a stronger structure to absorb the impact of landing on rough airstrips. Powered by an uprated version of the V12 Liberty engine that drove the NB-1, now producing 420 horsepower instead of 400, the first NB-2 made its maiden flight on the 3rd of September 1920, less than 3 months after the type had first been ordered. In test flights, the NB-2 was a vast improvement over its predecessor. Though it had a slower top speed of just 99 miles per hour, owing to its heavier weight and payload capacity, it was far easier to handle, easier to service, and much, much easier to land, courtesy of the new and improved landing gear. The first 5 bombers were then delivered under the original designation of NB-2, with the first 2 being retained for additional service testing and research purposes. But the remaining 15 of the order would be delivered under a new designation, NBS-1, which stood for Night Bomber Short Range. Interestingly, these would be the only production bombers in the United States that would ever receive an official night bomber designation, as future changes in the Army aerial doctrine would remove the distinction between day and nighttime bombing, mostly because they would focus on daytime bombing strategies for the rest of the interwar period. Following the release of a glowing report from its service trials, the design of the NB-2 was then purchased by the Army for further production. However, with the exception of the initial order for 20 NB-2s, Glenn Martin would not produce the rest of what would eventually amount to a production run of 130. This would seem like a modest number compared to some production runs seen in Europe for this time, but for the US Army Air Service this was a significant financial investment. The other 110 Martin bombers produced would be built by 3 different companies, partly because the US government wanted to provide work to multiple manufacturers and keep the ailing US aircraft industry somewhat alive, but mostly because they were offering to build the aircraft at a much cheaper cost. The Aeromarine Plane and Motor Company would build 25 bombers, LWF Engineering would produce 35, and Curtiss would build the final 50. The last 20 aircraft built by Curtiss were also completed with experimental turbo superchargers, though they were not formally operated with them owing to some woeful reliability problems in these very early models. Despite being undercut by his competitors, Glenn Martin himself was magnanimous, and he would send detailed design copies of the aircraft's design drawings to each company, along with assembly notes and feedback from his own work team at the Cleveland factory. The initial order for 20 bombers was completed by Martin by the end of 1920, and work was begun at the other factories by the start of the following year. The entire production run of 130 bombers was complete by 1922, with the majority of the aircraft entering service with the 2nd Bombardment Group in Virginia, joining the 11th, 20th, 49th, and 96th bombing squadrons. It was the aircraft operated by the 96th Squadron that would earn much of the type's fame, when they would take part in Billy Mitchell's Project B. In the summer of 1921, over 125 aircraft would take part in various tests to evaluate the effectiveness of air attacks against various naval vessels, ranging in size from destroyers all the way up to full capital ships. This put Mitchell in direct opposition to the US Navy, who very much doubted the effectiveness of conventional bombs against very heavily armoured ships like battlecruisers or battleships. Now, the details and events of Project B are a story for another day, and definitely a video I would like to do in the future, as it was somewhat controversial and very interesting. But the Martin bomber did play a crucial role in helping to prove Mitchell's point, and cause no small amount of irritation and embarrassment for several senior naval officials. On the 21st of July 1921, the ex-German battleship Ostfriesland was subjected to a series of attacks by Martin NBS-1 bombers, which dropped 1,100-pound bombs, scoring 3 direct hits, and later on in the day they would use the brand new 2,000-pound high-explosive demolition bomb. Now, these larger weapons were not targeted directly on the ship, but were instead aimed to land immediately adjacent, using the massive water pressure from an underwater explosion to buckle the ship's hull plates. The surface impacts from the 1,100-pound bombs did little damage, but 3 of the 2,000-pounders, dropped very close to the battleship, did enough damage that it sank within 22 minutes of the first explosion. Ostfriesland would not be the Martin bomber's only victim either. To prove to the Navy that the sinking wasn't a fluke, the NBS-1 was used to sink 3 other capital ships, this time of American heritage. Firstly, the pre-dreadnought battleship Alabama was sunk in September of 1921, and then, 2 years later, she was joined by the pre-dreadnoughts Virginia and New Jersey, also sunk by bombs dropped by the NBS-1. Now, as it would turn out, and not surprisingly, embarrassing naval and army traditionalists would be the most action that the NBS-1 would experience in its service life. Between 1920 and 1929, the type would put in diligent, albeit boring service, training up the nucleus of America's future bombing fleet, and providing a wealth of much-needed experience to an air service that would spend most of the 1920s A. playing catch-up with its hypothetical rivals, and B. fighting for its very existence against an often hostile administration. Towards the end of its service life in 1927, the type would find itself in front of cameras once again, though this time it wasn't the newsreel. A single NBS-1 was used in the silent film Wings, modified to appear like a German Gotha bomber. But aside from this brief appearance in the world's first Academy Award-winning film, the Martin bomber faded away peacefully. In 1928, it began to be replaced by the new aircraft being produced by Keystone, and by mid-1929 the transition was complete. Unfortunately, there are no surviving examples of this pioneering machine today, but there is a full-scale replica, which was built off the original design drawings, which can be found at the National Museum of the US Air Force in Ohio. There, it can be found alongside the Martin B-10, a revolutionary design from the 1930s, which we've also covered on this channel, And it's actually interesting to note that until the B-10 arrived in 1932, it was the NBS-1, which was first flown way back in 1920, that was used as the standard to which all prospective bombing aircraft would be judged by the US Army. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you, of course, to the patrons. Now, it has been about 6 weeks since the last video went live on the channel, but I can now finally say that I am properly back. I'm in my new office, and I've got pretty much everything more or less set up, so regular videos are going to resume. Probably at the rate of about 1 per week until I find my feet again, and then the rate will probably increase a bit more from there. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier supporters, and a warm welcome to Kettlehead and Aidan Wilker, who are the newest members of this special group. I also want to extend a second thank you to the Patreon supporters who voted on the change to the channel icon, of which the more eagle-eyed of you may have already spotted. Now, it's a change I've wanted to do for a while, and in fact the artwork was completed almost a year ago by a wonderful subscriber who I commissioned, and I've just been indecisive about it for far too long. But the change is done now, and I am quite happy with it. Let me know what you think as well. Anyway, that is all from me for today. It's good to be back. I'll be posting some sort of update/video planning video in the near future. But until then, thank you all so much for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.